we do our jobs right, we're going to raise a few eyebrows tonight, which is what we try and do, but in an intellectual way, to drive some curiosity, to dig deeper into the Bible and learn about what this world is all about. People were starving for information and not just the superficial stuff. They wanted it backed up and they wanted details with it. If you're a Christian and you have any sort of doubts, whether or not you come over to the evidence and information I provide, you're going to say, I've never seen somebody go this deep and back it up so much with Scripture.
What's the answer? Show me the answer. And that's not really the way the texts were written, and it's not really the way the ancient people approached it. They looked at it as, where's the mystery? Mysteries are revealed by divinity. And what questions should I be asking? And why is this written in a way to draw me into something larger that's going on and make me start thinking a certain way?
There's going to be interaction and things done or in context of what's going around Israel all of the time. And in fact, Israel, and even with Christianity, has been subject to the beast empires all throughout the history and will continue to do so through the end time. So there's a relationship there that we need to understand. And to understand the enemy, we should probably know a little bit more about it.
What in the world is going on?
Everybody sort of talks today and ever since the pandemic in a more increased manner is what's going on in the world that it's on such the wrong track. And everybody knows things are out of place. It's not sort of what it was. If you looked at the days of Noah, which I think Christians need to understand more about the days of Noah, about the violence and the godlessness and the source to that and the extent of that, as opposed to just sort of blushing over and saying, okay, well, people are just going to continue as they did. Jesus is referencing the days of Noah in the words of the Old Testament. The days of Noah were 600 years before the flood and 350 years after the flood in Genesis 9:29. And as the Messiah and as the Word of God, the whole Bible is the Word of Jesus, he would not pick a reference with identical words translated from Greek into English and Hebrew into English that would have the same words. And so he's encouraging us to learn what happened, because nothing is new under the sun. What was will be again. So whatever happened on both sides of the flood within Noah's generation is going to be coming back in the end time as all things are completed in preparation for the millennium. Jerusalem is the epicenter of end time prophecy, so they have to be in control of it. So if there is a start to that generation, I would say it's there. And if that's what's going on, then what is going wrong in the world is we're in what they call the birthing sorrows or the birth pangs. And we're seeing these catastrophes start to happen. They include, if people aren't familiar with the birth sorrows, are earthquakes, which are getting stronger continually over the last 30 years and more often. You have pestilence, that's part of it. Of course, we went through a large pestilence, and pandemic, which would be associated with that, and wars and rumors of war. But look for those to get stronger and start working together, and look for them all to be contrived. Because this is not God's judgment on us. This is what we are doing to ourselves. And, and the whole world would be destroyed by fire, as it would have been from before the flood, except God brought the flood to permit a restart for the reasons I mentioned earlier about the book of life, and that unless Jesus were not to step in the year of the Lord's wrath, and at the time of Armageddon, no flesh would be destroyed. And according to 2 Peter 3, the destruction of the end is by fire, just as it was at some unknown time in the beginning. The beginning thing is to look for these birthing sorrows to get stronger. So we're going to have more pestilence, and they're going to get worse as they go. And they're going to be created in either through a biological weapon that's done, or how the last pestilence was seemingly designed to maybe not get out of a lab, but found its way out of the lab. I mean, I won't go to exactly how, but the more the information comes out, we see more of the cover-up on that it could not have been a natural mutation. And it's absolutely amazing that they would cover this up. But if they want people to prepare for global government and the global religion that will come first, because it will be required, then they have to cattle herd us into a specific direction. They have to create the catastrophes, create the problem, provide the solution, which actually makes it worse. It's the typical sort of thing that they do. And so their answer if it didn't get them all the way where they wanted to go on the first one, then they double down. It's always, we didn't do enough, or we didn't introduce it the right way. So, and you have to have that ability if you're going to do, from a scriptural perspective, what we're warned of is watch out for the false prophets that are coming. And the false prophets will make the way for Babylon, which is known in several sort of compartments, one of them being a universal religion. But it's more than that. We should understand it in its entirety. But from the glue that's going to bring about the world government, it's going to be the rise of the religion, and it takes the false prophets, and they need to be able to predict catastrophes to scare people into their religion and have it happen on time. So he had to have knowledge, is the Masonic sort of understanding of knowledge of the stars, knowledge of engineering, mathematics, all sorts of things that was taught to him, that was passed on to Cain, passed on to his son Enoch, who puts it into the 7 sacred sciences that we know as the 7 liberal arts today, not to honor the God of the Bible, but to lead people away from God, to discredit God, dismiss God, not give him credit for anything, and to honor the pantheon of gods that he's going to accept. And this is going to be the start of mysticism, because it's mysticism is a knowledge cult, and that this knowledge is going to be developed, and it can't go to the Sethites, can't go to the mundane. It can only go to the nobility elite that they're going to set up. And this knowledge merges with the knowledge from the angels, the fallen angels, and they receives angelic technology to take it to a level of knowledge that we don't have today. We're only catching up. It's a combination of the knowledge, right? Yeah. It's on steroids. So, and this is the knowledge that is going to create a level of violence we can't imagine. And so, yes, the giants were created. Yes, they usurped all of the kingships and the civilizations around the world. Yes, they had that Enochian mysticism, as I like to call it, as that original pantheon and religion. But they developed the arts of war, and according to the book of Enoch, is that Azazel taught not only the craft, but all of the arts of making weapons, of doing martial arts, of strategy. And so angelic technology that we're just catching up to would imply that this would have the ability to destroy the world by fire if permitted to play out. But God brings the flood to prevent that. And they had the technology to corrupt the whole earth. That's the Hebrew word shakath. It means to decay, to pervert, to ruin, to destroy. That they destroyed the natural genomes of plants and the DNA of animals and of humans through interbreeding and other DNA manipulation. According to polytheists, they did all sorts of chimera-type animals that we use that term of to honor that history in science today, where it comes from. And this knowledge starts to make sense of God calling the 8 to the ark, to make the ark, and then all the animals, because he knew which representatives or kinds within the species that were still pure and not corrupted to restart the earth afterwards. So it starts to make a lot of sense of where that sort of knowledge comes from. And so when we look at the knowledge that is now going to cross the flood, and we can talk a little bit about that if you like. But this is the knowledge that's on steroids that was taught to Adam in Eden. And so this is the knowledge that we should start to recognize that we're being sped up on, just as it was in the time of Noah that you have the giants being created, and then this rapid advancement of technology to completely destroy the earth. So when you read what the violence and the godlessness Jesus is talking about in the days of Noah, the violence comes from the giants. The times where the whole earth was being corrupted in terms of plants and DNA manipulation, and the godlessness was forced imposed religion on the whole world by the demigod giant kings who controlled the earth at that point. And so the religion that crosses the flood begins at Babel through, according again to Polychronicon and the history of the Gnostics and the Masons, is that fellow by the name of Harmine or Hermes, which is part of the Trismegistus, finds the pillar that floated versus the one that would survive fire, and they didn't know which one was coming by the inference there. So they did a pillar of each that showed the direction to all of the knowledge of the antediluvians that Enoch had written into 36,525 books stacked on 9 vaults. Buried below the earth underneath the Great Pyramid, which was used to build the pyramid from his technology. Again, according to the Freemasons. He takes that knowledge to Nimrod and uses that knowledge, and we don't get the explanation where the knowledge Nimrod gets to build Babel City and Babel Tower, and whatever technology that was there that was Nimrod was planning for it, and or what made Nimrod become a mighty one, because he wasn't born one. So there's an inference of knowledge there, and he is crowned as the Grand Master after the flood, first Grand Master of ancient Royal Masonry after the flood, and writes the first constitution, and he imposes this Enochian mysticism at Babel. And of course, Babylon, as it's described and understanding it as a religion, is a mystery religion, an initiatory religion, as all mystical religions are around the world. So if you understand secret societies, you'll understand that the top levels are all royal bloodlines, and the lower levels are all more diluted bloodlines. So it's the same. And as you get into the adept level, they're communicating with fallen angels, demons, you know, they call them a whole bunch of different things, the celestial white masters, the great white, what do they call it? The great white, doesn't matter. There's a white name that goes along with it. It could be aliens, could be spirit guides. It's all that hierarchy of the fallen ones that includes the invisible ones that are the spirit angels and their offspring that they produced both before and after the flood to run the visible world. So just as we're told in the New Testament that we're fighting both visible ones and invisible ones, not just flesh and blood, and that's kind of a poor translation in the KJV. It should be sort of talked about as we don't fight just flesh and blood, but also these principalities and angels that are in high places and the dark forces of the world. So it's both that we fight, and the ones on the earth are doing the bidding of the fallen angels and the demons, and demons are disembodied spirits of the giants. I won't go into a lot of detail on that unless you want me to get into that.
We've covered that.
Yeah. And that the fallen angels do that because they know the power of El Elyon, God Most High.
I just want to clarify for our listeners, because again, some are very familiar with this and some are, their heads are spinning and they're going, what is he trying to say? What you're describing is that the earth operates on authority structures.
Yes.
And that when it comes to those very earthly authority structures, you have an intermingling between humans, and specifically humans of specific bloodlines, and non-human things that some people would call aliens or extraterrestrials, but you know, more correctly are unclean spirits or spirits from disembodied Nephilim, all the way back to, you know, much higher spirits of fallen angels. And that in that you have this empowering of a proxy rulership on Earth, where there's a control level that's working from the top down, and you're pointing out that Paul seems to be very aware of this, and that's why he's pointing these things out.
Yes, and so you have beings that are being represented in this world in Lord of the Rings. And so you have like dwarves that are living in the mountains that made the weapons for the giants in that belief system. And that the gnomes were the ones who held the technology for the giants and held the genealogies. And they had UAPs or UFOs that would come through portals. And they have that even after the flood. And these are called the gray gnomes. And they have the same description as the grays in the alien mythos and do the same type of kidnapping and experimentation as the grays do. In the Lord of the Rings, you have the white elves. The white elves are a larger being than the little people, and the elves are represented in the little people as dark elves versus the white elves. So in the Lord of the Rings, you get this pale, tall, white elf. That is a representation or an allegory for the Tuatha Dé Danann, both before and after the flood, who are pale-skinned, either blonde-haired and blue-eyed or red-haired and hazel eyes. And typically in Lord of the Rings, it's the blonde hair and blue eyes one, because Tolkien is talking about the Norse Tuatha Dé Danann. The assembly of the Detanu is the assembly of the Tuatha Dé Danann. They're known by a lot of different names around the world, from the Sede or the Shay or the C, however you want to pronounce that. The Shay. There's several different ways to pronounce that, just as Tuatha Danann, the Danawa, also known in the Middle East as the tribe, or the Tuatha Danu, as being the tribe of Anu. And notice you have an Anu on the Tetanu, and in the old knowledge of linguistics, the D and the T were sort of interchangeable. So you could have had that as Dedan, as it shows up in Hebrew, or it could be Titan as it shows up in Greek, knowing that you have titans of heaven and the titans of the earth that they created as their spurious offspring, the demigods, people like Hercules and Perseus and giants like that. And these are all talking about the same sort of types of beings. So in the Lord of the Rings, you have the white elves. The white elves are a larger being than the little people, and the elves are represented in the little people as dark elves versus the white elves. So in the Lord of the Rings, you get this pale, tall, white elf. That is a representation or an allegory for the Tuatha Dé Danann, both before and after the flood, who are pale-skinned, either blonde-haired and blue-eyed or red-haired and hazel eyes. And typically in Lord of the Rings, it's the blonde hair and blue eyes one, because Tolkien is talking about the Norse Tuatha Dé Danann. The assembly of the Detanu is the assembly of the Tuatha Dé Danann. They're known by a lot of different names around the world, from the Sede or the Shay or the C, however you want to pronounce that. The Shay. There's several different ways to pronounce that, just as Tuatha Danann, the Danawa, also known in the Middle East as the tribe, or the Tuatha Danu, as being the tribe of Anu. And notice you have an Anu on the Tetanu, and in the old knowledge of linguistics, the D and the T were sort of interchangeable. So you could have had that as Dedan, as it shows up in Hebrew, or it could be Titan as it shows up in Greek, knowing that you have titans of heaven and the titans of the earth that they created as their spurious offspring, the demigods, people like Hercules and Perseus and giants like that. And these are all talking about the same sort of types of beings. So these white elves are the Tuatha Dé Danann, who are known as the fairy folk, the fair folk, and they were giants.
Yeah.
The Fae, yes. So that's that representation of the giants in the Lord of the Rings. And what's interesting as well, you have at the end of the Lord of the Rings, you have all of these different creatures sailing off on a boat on the water. And that's a representation, because it's the time of man now, and that's a representation of the flood, and that all these creatures sort of disappear or are destroyed or driven to another portal, however you want to
Very
interpret.
similar to the Narnia ending as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, they were best buds. They were to the same Inkling Rosicrucian Society. They're both royales, and I have a 6-part series on Tolkien and Lewis that I chart that's verified at no charge, and I trace in parts 5 and 6 each of their royal bloodlines, because there's no way you could have a non-Masonic person or adept in a Rosicrucian society if you understand the hierarchical order of the Thelemic tree. It's just not probable or likely. And so they already had knowledge as royales that are initiated from childhood. They were far beyond adept level. In fact, as a royale, you don't take an adept title until you're somewhere between 25 and 30 years old. So they're still at university. They're not of that age, but yet they're in this Rosicrucian-sponsored society. They're there to learn the writing craft, and they take their knowledge of the occult and write terrific literature and fantasy tales in their mythopoetic style. But it's got all of their belief systems, their history, and their genealogies embedded into the characters, places, and allegories that they lay throughout the Bible. It's the classic fairy tale concept. In fact, they called the Bible a fairy tale. They're talking about that same sort of writing style when they make that reference.
And the difference is when they say fairy tale, they believe what they're saying. Meaning when we say fairy tale, we mean, oh, it's nothing. When they say fairy tale, they're talking about something of substance with actual history to it. So it's almost a backwards compliment when they say, oh, it's a fairy tale. To them, that means it's true.
The royal families and the bloodlines and Nephilim roots. If you could just describe that a little more, so people know what it is you're talking about when you say that, and talk about an eyebrow-raising type comment is to say, like, modern-day royals could trace their roots back.
Yeah. So I'll start off with King Charles III. And when he was still Prince Charles, he's on record, and I have the links to that if people want to get a hold of me, that he said he takes his genealogies back in part because he has scion or a noble grafting of royal bloodlines into his bloodline. He takes his bloodlines back to Vlad the Impaler, which was a classic noble Celt, a fair folk. He was large, he had red hair, he had pale skin, hazel eyes, light condition, commonly known as Dracula, which means son of a dragon. A seraphim angel is a dragon angel, serpent-faced, and rooted in Greek draconta, meaning watcher or watcher angel. So anyways, I digress. And so he keeps
and just
track
for
of
people who don't know, Vlad the Impaler was not a nice guy.
Oh no, he was an awful guy.
He earned his nickname.
Yeah, and based on and the character in an allegory that Dracula by Bram Stoker was based on, right? And what's interesting about Vlad the Impaler, both his father and both Vlad and his father, also named Vlad, they took their genealogies back to the Scythians of the Tuatha De Danann, and that it went all the way back to a tribe of Hercules, the Agrathi. And of course, Hercules, after the flood, is the son of Alchemy, his mother, a human female, and Zeus. And they had a Herculides bloodline. So you have I want to lay that down as a premise as how we understand that today. So the royals keep all of their genealogies back into the mists of time, back to a specific patriarchal Nephilim, and maybe if they're grafted in bloodlines, several. And that they also keep those genealogies that would go back by inference to a specific celestial mafia godfather, as I like to call him, or a Nephilim, a fallen one. And so that level of ennobleness and pureness will show where they fit in the overall royal culture around the world. And they created heraldry to reflect that. So they put angelic beings in their coats of arms. And so then they used to put it on a standard in older times, that then when they rode on horses into other nations, they would take their standard with their coat of arms, and the royals there would know instantly who they are in terms of the taciturn information that's being passed on. So you have the royals as believing they have the divine right to rule. They're the spurious offspring of fallen angels and gods. And they receive their authority from the assembly of the gods, as we've talked about. And King James was one, probably the most famous for expressing that. And of course, he has the unicorn and the lion on his coat of arms. And of course, you have Rem, which means wild bull in the KJV, the mighty Gabor Prince James, as I would take the meaning of mighty there back to the word Gabor, which described giants. And unicorn was substituted for a wild bull, reflective of building his empire and relationship and passages to Mount Hermon. So let's say with Ephraim, where they were going to gore the world around, with its horn around the world, that's a unicorn there. And it should be a wild bull. Could be a single horn wild bull, but it's not this horse that we would sort of associate it with as a unicorn, right? When we look at what the royals are doing, is they're just using language in plain sight to say that they're superior to humans, and that they come from the Nephilim, who usurped the thrones and the governments before the flood and enslaved humankind and tried to wipe them from the face of the earth, which they were created to do for their fathers. And then again, after the flood, that they're created, only this time there's something a little bit different about the giants with the Rephaim, as the terrible ones that they're called in Ezekiel 32, which is Erit or Eritim, as the terrible ones that did terrible things while they were on earth and were slain, and are now shown in the sides of the pit prison, along with the angels that are also there, are speaking to another royal, Pharaoh Rephaim, a terrible one. You have an understanding that these terrible ones, these royals, have this long-lasting dynastic bloodline that is going to create not only the beast empires, but the whole noble elite around the world. So that word royal goes back to Old French roi for king and el for an angel, and back to Latin from regus, and words like that from the Latin, and then back to Indo-Aryan for rule or ruler, which was the Nephilim and the Rephaim language. They like to call themselves as Rex Deus or Rex Deus, which means kings of God, just as Royal means kings of God. And Royal were understood as a superior bloodline, as you take that meaning back in its etymology, just as they looked at themselves as demigods, part angel and part human. But what happens is that they have, when you see a marriage in Genesis 36, for example, you have Esau, who's the brother of Jacob, whose name changes to Israel, of course, to produce the 12 tribes. He lost all of the blessings and the inheritance and the Messianic promise to his little brother. I mean, twins, but he was the first one out. And so normally he would have inherited that. Well, what he does, he marries in one of the wives a person named by the name of Oholibama. And she is the daughter of Anna, son of Seir in Genesis 36. And Seir is a Horim. He's a giant. And so you have this hybrid race that is going on to create a new dynasty, but not through through the female of Anna's daughter. And so you also have Eliphaz, the son of Esau, who's going to marry Timnah, who is the daughter of Seir, the Horim again. So he creates the Amalekite race with a pure blood fairy queen, and they're called dukes, Hebrew aleph, which the occult takes fairy, elf, elven, all those types of words back to in part of the allegory. And the tribes of Edom are going to intermarry with famous dynasties like the Mitanni and the Kassites and others into other Indo-Aryans as they take their genealogies back. So understand that biblically we get a transition that's documented as an addition to the table of nations in Genesis 36 to create hybrid Amalekites in this case, versus the giants that are Amalekites shown in Genesis 14 a few hundred years earlier in the War of Giants. So that can't be the start of the name. They take that name eponymously, and then they move to Petra, and they live amongst the Amalekite giants. But we see this hybrid human and giant race beginning. It's the necessity to bring in human bloodlines. So we have a tribe of giants in Genesis 14 in the War of Giants, and then in the land that God is awarding Abraham between the Nile and the Euphrates, the same location as Eden is at. Most people don't make that sort of connection. That's God's land, of the land preserved amongst himself and the other sons of Israel, as we've talked about previous in the show, or the gods. And that you have a fellow by the name of Rapha, which is the root word for Rephaim. Rephaim is the male plural again. And so we have a tribe of the Rephaim in Genesis 14 and a tribe of Rephaim in Genesis 15, along with other ones like the triple K there that don't have patriarchs, that go back to the table of nations and also unexplained. And that's telling us that if it's a Rephaim patriarch, they're not going to be listed in the table of nations. And that's why the Amorites don't have it. So we have another example of that with Arba. If people aren't familiar with Arba, that's the name that Hebron was named before it was changed to Hebron. It was called Kiriath Arba, or the city of Arba. And Arba in the book of Joshua is the patriarch for the Anakim, who in Deuteronomy 2 are described as giants, Rapha. Yeah. And Horim are described as giants there, Rapha, right? And in the singular, which is important in some cases. So we have another example of a Rephaim patriarch not listed in the table of nations. So if we start to look at those nines, you could look at perhaps looking for a Rephaim patriarch that married a daughter of Canaan, or a daughter of Heth, or a daughter of Sidon, to create these hybrids so that the giants wouldn't go extinct. And so in book 2, I'll take those patriarchless nations and trace them back to a specific Rephaim patriarch through the Bible.
So how much do you think they know why it is they're doing that? Like, are they just following the tradition or the royal rules that were set up? Or do you think these people actually know how deep that runs and how far
they
back
know?
it goes?
They have the history. They believe they are the descendants of their genealogy that they trace back. And they're trying to bring about the end time. And they would like to do it before the ordained time. And they want that showdown with God because they've been deceived by their masters that they have a chance to win.
There's a lot there.
So when you hear the 13 families, that's the 13 families that we would understand it as the Western bloodlines. Doesn't mean there might not be another 13 families of bloodlines around the world. For example, let's say a reemergence of the Shah dynasty bloodlines from the dragon creator gods, from the sons of heaven, because they have the same story. Once that was taken down by the virus that the Western bloodlines launched on China, Germany, and Russia, with something they called social masonry that created communism and national socialism to eliminate rival bloodlines. That family bloodline comes down in China in two main forms, and one particular that's important is the Western bloodline, but the bloodlines of the Li spelt in several different ways, whether it's L-E-E in English or L-I or whatever the different transliterations are, and or X-I. So the Shah dynasties was X-I-A. And Xi is a family name from the Shah dynasty, and we have a Xi that is back on the leadership of China and wants to be there for life, and would not be surprised if he's dynastically orientated, that would like to seemingly have a successor of his own going forward, who might be rebuilding one of those empires. You have a fellow in Russia who is named Putin, and he originally comes from Kiev. Through his genealogy that shows up out of nowhere in about the 1850s as Putin. And the Putyanin was the first bloodline of the Ukraine and of Kiev, and they started a branch bloodline and dynasty in Moscow in about 1000 AD with Vladimir the Great Putyanin. And then in the 1600s, through intermarriage, you have a junior offshoot, just as the Plantagenets are a junior offshoot of the Anjou. As an example, another example, you have the Romanovs through intermarriage taking over, and they're the ones that are wiped out at the beginning of World War I in this war of rivals. And the Western bloodlines always thought that the Kievan bloodline was too pure, and so they were taking sort of a higher position and weren't cooperating, which was part of the rivalries that sort of went on. Now, Putin's name comes up in the 1850s, and there's a tradition in the Putyanin tradition of the Ukraine that if you had a child out of wedlock, you would make sure they're still part of the nobility, but not part of the inner royal family, and you couldn't take the full name. And so, according to Putin and newspaper stories that were put out in the 2000s to create his mythos, whether this is true or not, this is what they put out. I mean, people can judge for themselves, and that he also honors Vladimir the Great with a statue that he has in Moscow. So he seems to might be taken with his own mythos, but he believes, according to this line of thought, that he is an illegitimate son of the Putyanin dynasty. So that what he's trying to do is recreate the Romanov dynasty, as what he said with the interview with Tucker Carlson. And so he's not going to destroy Kiev because that's a holy city for him. But he wants Kiev. And he is dynastically inclined as well, you could say. And so what people like President Trump were saying, people like Putin continue to say, people like Xi continue to say, is it's not that we are against the New World Order, that I like to call the Nephilim World Order or the Nephilim World Order. They want a larger role in what the Western European bloodlines are trying to impose. And that's the Wars and the Rumors of War that's going to settle out into these 10 toes, 10 kings, 10 horns of the Seventh Empire. And it's going to be groups of nations, empires. So you're going to have 5 on each foot. I don't know whether you can read that allegory, that you can see it rising up with the alliance of India, China, Russia, Persia. But it looks like there's an alignment coming up, and I would probably expect Germany to go over there as well before it all shakes out, and probably out of need for energy, just as India has that same requirement. And if that alliance starts to sound familiar with how you trace nations from the Table of Nations, look for those groups of nations in Ezekiel 38 with the Gog War. Gog of Magog, chief prince of Meshech, and Meshech is the etymological root for the city of Moscow. Gog is understood as you take that back to Greek in the New Testament and Hebrew in the Old Testament, as an allegory for an end-time Antichrist-like figure. Not the Antichrist, but one of the wannabes, probably the one that Antichrist will use for his pedigree as his Armageddon to deceive the world, that he's going to bring in an age of peace after winning the counterfeit Armageddon war. And Gog doesn't show up in the Table of Nations, but Magog does. Right? Which is really kind of interesting. But there's a parent god before the flood who bore giants. And interestingly enough, the three ones that are the most famous are Gog, Magog, and Albion. And giants of that name also show up after the flood in mythology, because it's typical to name giants after the flood from names before the flood. One other example might be Gilgamesh, as in the Epic of Gilgamesh, or he inherits this mythos and his name changes to that, however you want to get there. But this is 6th generation after the flood. He's the son of Lugalbanda, king of Uruk, and the mother goddess Nin. But in Enoch Book of Giants, there's a Gilgamesh before the flood. So that happens. And Gog is a common name for part of these Gyges kings of the Herculides after the flood as well. I cover all of this off in book 2 if people are interested in a lot more detail. So I think we're seeing perhaps a group that is establishing their own banking system, their own credit card system, their own currency system, and their own alliance that's going to stand against the Western alliance that uses the U.S. as their attack dog. And Trump opposes that. And there's a price to do that if you want me to continue to do that. So it's not like I dislike a lot of things that Trump does, but I recognize he just wants a larger role. And I find that suspicious. The New Testament tells us that the Word created all things, both in John 1 and Colossians 1. And that, so when one sort of says, well, what's that word said in Genesis 1? That's the Hebrew word amar, as in spoke. That's the Word of God. And so Elohim can be understood, and you have to sort of take it back to the Hebrew and understand the context. Elohim can be singular in nature, even though it's the plural of El, if it's in the uppercase and it's referring to El Elyon, God Most High. And so you have the word there as in the words of God. So the world is created by the word at God's command, and the Spirit is there because it's going to add the spirit of life into everything. And so you have all three there. And then if you look at 2 Peter 3, not only is it talking about a day being for humans 1,000 years, but it's talking about this earth that perished. Well, the earth didn't perish in the flood. So when it's talking about the world that was in the water, that was out of the water, that's in the water, or whatever use of the three different words of the water there are, I may not have quite quoted it accurately, but something else is going on there. And in day 6, what we learned, or in the days 1 through 6, is what we learned, that God separates the water of below into the waters of above to create the firmament, so that life can be renewed on the earth, just as Psalms 104 says, when and at the same time it's describing the creation of the angels and other creation events, that when God sends his Spirit, the earth is renewed. Well, that's kind of interesting. And that if the rebellion happened before Eden and the earth was renewed, that means there might have been a destruction sometime before. And if the people that were created on day 6 and before Adam were under the overlordship of the fallen angels, just as we are, that they would have led all of those people astray, just as they led the Nahash astray. And then if that rebellion happened even before, as the gap theory people talk about, it would be between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. And how they get there is that the word was void and formless. That's the Hebrew word haya. And you can translate that as was or became. Well, that's kind of interesting. And haya is the root word for Yahweh as well, or Jehovah. And so it either is, or it was, or it became, depending on how you want to look at that. And then you look at the word tuhu and buhu in Hebrew for void and formless, and it's inferring a destruction of some sort. If the world somehow became that way, then that would infer some sort of destruction. That would be a nice fit for where the angelic rebellion came from, whereas in the accounts out of polytheism, it talks about angelic technology and the wars of the gods that had planet-destroying capability.
Vedas have a lot of this. You get to the Vedas and some of these very, very old documents that talk about these cosmic conflicts that were unbelievably destructive and divine.
So back to 2 Peter 3. And it's talking about that the world that perished and was destroyed in fire, that's reserved for the end time. Nothing new is under the sun. What was will be again. And that there was this early destruction that destroyed the earth by fire that were not talked about. And it's not the flood, because the flood didn't destroy it. So if you had this angelic war and you destroyed the earth and destroyed it down to the foundations, as you would lead into some passages out of Job and elsewhere in Psalms 104, that if you were going to renew the earth, or if you had that kind of destruction, then the waters above would collapse into the chaos. And then if you wanted to renew the earth, as part of that process, you'd have to separate those waters to create the firmament again. And so things sort of kind of start to fall in place on that, to start to put more of the armor of God on, in case we are in the fig tree generation, and every generation should prepare that they might be.
We got to be ready.
We have to be ready, and that we can't count on the modern churches to prepare us. In fact, they're not preparing us. They don't teach prophecy, and they don't teach prehistory. They only take selective parts of the most preternatural book that was ever written and apply it. They teach good principles, but we need the context. We need to know the reason of our being, and we need to understand that we can't even begin to imagine what might be coming at us if it's going to be truly like the days of Noah that he warned us from, that even the elect will be deceived. He warned that. And that the only thing he promises us is to save us from the wrath, the year of the Lord's wrath, and the time or the hour of a trial or temptation, depending on which Bible translation that you're reading there. And there's an hour that is very specific, that is centered around the mark of the beast, the rise of Antichrist to power with that hour in Revelation 17, the hour that Jesus comes back. It's all the same Hebrew word, and the hour that Babylon is destroyed as the first part of Antichrist's reign of the 3.5 years to replace with his other religion. So no matter what, we're going to go through tribulation if we're in the fig tree generation, and all Christians are said to prepare to go through tribulation. It's just part of, you choose this, you will go through tribulation, but the rewards will be there.